So, but if you'll begin by telling us your name, your title, and what you do.
I'm Michael Doane. I work for the Nature Conservancy. I'm our global lead for a priority we call providing food and water sustainably, and I live right here in Kansas City. I'm also a member of Resurrection Downtown. It's a church that we joined about 3 years ago when we moved to the city. Really enjoy it.
Excellent. Tell us about the Nature Conservancy. What do they do?
You know, the Nature Conservancy is one of the longest standing environmental organizations in the world. It was started in 1951 in upstate New York by a group of citizen scientists who became concerned that there was a rare plant that was, to their knowledge, only found in one location. And they did what any of us would do. They put a second mortgage on their home, they raised the money to buy that land and manage it for the conservation of that species. And that started the land conservation movement in this country almost 70 years ago. So now we're an organization that is the largest environmental NGO in the world. We are science-led, we're very pragmatic, we like business, we like governments that make good policies for their people. We're very solution-oriented, and we're hopeful. We think that there are solutions to all the environmental challenges, and they can be congruent with good standards of living and prosperity. And so we have programs all around the world. We're very active here. We got chapters in Kansas and Missouri, a lot of members right here in Kansas City area.
Excellent. And so let's talk briefly, you might kind of give your thumbnail sketch of climate change and the role that humans are playing in that.
Climate change is a complex topic, for sure, and there's different views on how severe it is, what the causes are. To summarize, I would say my personal view and our organization's view is it's real. It's more human-made than not, and the implications are potentially very profound. They have the potential to really unwind a lot of the way nature works today. We take for granted, you know, a moderate temperature compatible with being able to live, having plenty of fresh water, having plenty of food to eat, having resources for the future generations. And I don't think it's overstating it that all of that is at risk with climate change. And so I think it's an important topic. It's certainly complex. There's certainly some uncertainty. But for our sake, you know, as an organization, we've decided the time to act is now. We can't wait. We have enough information. We need to be dedicated to really implementing the solutions in this generation. Excellent.
Before we jump into some of the solutions that you all are proposing, you mentioned your devotional. So I want you to, you know, when I get to the end of the sermon, what I'm asking is, what would Jesus say about this? So as you think about that, what do you think?
Well, Adam, I am a person of faith. It's part of my identity. It's not something completely separate. It's not compartmentalized in my life. It's one of the reasons I chose this occupation. And so I think we have a moral responsibility to act on what we know. I think God made us in His image. He asked us to be stewards. He asked us to be responsible for what He had created. It's a great opportunity, I think. And with that, I think He gave us some intelligence and gave us a soul, and we kind of feel one with Him when we're in nature. Somebody that I learned about a few years ago, and I've really studied, is a gentleman by the name of John Muir. John Muir had an upbringing very similar to mine. He grew up in a farming family. He grew up in a very religious family, same as me. It was out of his religious convictions that he became really interested in nature. He really started the environmental movement in this country well over 100 years ago. So when we think about Earth Day, it was chosen to coincide with John Muir's birthday. That's how big of a figure John Muir is in the global environmental movement. And he did that because he was a person of faith, fundamentally. So I think that that's been instructive for me in thinking about my occupation, what I do. But also, I think it's helpful for anybody that's a person of faith to think about what can we do because we are children of God. What's our responsibility given the great debate that's going on in society? Knowing what we know about what God commanded us to do with His creation.
Excellent. That's great. Let's talk about what we can do. So, I mentioned you on the phone that sometimes I hear people, and I think, gosh, it's, the answers are so big that what can I actually do? And I know you've come up with 3 categories of answers. I'd love for you to just kind of walk through those.
I think this problem just feels overwhelming in some respects, and I think it causes people to lose heart. I'm certainly not in that category. I absolutely believe that we can address this problem, and we can address it in a way that's good for the economy, good for future generations. And by acting now, we actually do lots of things that would be good for society. There's 3 categories in my way of thinking as a way to kind of approach this. The first is, I can do it. This is not something the government needs to act to make you do it or to set the wheels in motion to create the solutions. It's something that you can choose to do if you want to do it. It starts by making different food choices, eating plant-rich diets, eating more diverse foods, addressing food waste, farming, supporting food that comes from farming methods that are smart, really good for the soil, really don't convert native habitats. You might say, well, how do I make those choices? More and more companies are starting to demand that information and provide it as part of the what's on the pack, on the label. So as a consumer, you can make different choices on food. Now, without getting into all the detail, agriculture accounts for about 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So making different choices with the food we eat sends a signal to farmers and ranchers all around the world to do things that will address this issue. They can't do that. They can't act as expeditiously without consumers making different choices. The second is our household energy. There's just little things like, making sure that our homes are well insulated. We can choose to install LED light bulbs. We can buy power from the grid that comes from solar energy. Right here in Kansas City, Evergy has a program where you can subscribe to solar on the grid. You don't have to put the solar on your house. You can buy it off the grid. You can put geothermal in your home. That's a choice we just made in our home. Transportation would be another one. Just buying more efficient vehicles and making sure that they're tuned up. These are all choices that I think an individual needs to make in relationship to their own personal economy, but they're also an embodiment of our values. And so I think that as you make these choices on transportation and food and energy in your household, know that you're making a difference in climate. The second bucket that I would suggest is I can sponsor it. Now, there are certain things that are just beyond what we can do. If you look at the big drivers of climate change in terms of the contributing factors, some of those things don't happen right in your own personal economy. But there are ways to sponsor projects called carbon offsets, and you can do this as an individual. You can do this as an institution. For example, a church, like Church of the Resurrection, could choose to participate by buying carbon offsets. And these are projects that have been verified independently to draw down carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it in a way that is good for the people in the communities. I'll give you one example. I just got back from Kenya, a project that we have there, which is helping smallholder farmers put in biogas facilities where they can take, some of these farmers have cattle, they produce manure, the manure will produce biogas, they can capture that, and they can use that for their home cooking needs. Now, you'd say, what difference does that make? Today, what they're using is charcoal, and charcoal comes from the forest. It's one of the leading causes of deforestation in Africa right now, is the demand for cooking fuel for homes. So by helping a farmer invest in a biogas facility on their farm, they can make their own gas to provide cooking for their family, and that makes a huge difference for them. It lowers the emissions in their household as well. It's safer for the family. So there's lots of projects out there that you can invest in, and it's called a carbon offset. you know that you're getting a verified amount of carbon reduction in the atmosphere when you invest. And the third bucket, Adam, I think, is I can support it. And this is really where, if we are going to address climate change systematically for the next generation, we will need some government choices on how we build transportation infrastructure, how we build energy infrastructure, agriculture. So setting incentives that really set investment pathways that support the kind of technologies that will really scale these solutions up. But I would go at it in those three ways: what I can do, what I can sponsor, and eventually what I can support.
Excellent. Say a little bit more about what you can support and the. So you mentioned the incentives, but what are some of those other things that we need to be supporting as people? You know, policies, whatever else. What are some of the things that you think we should be advocating for?
So today, as a country, we could do more to lead on climate change in the world. In 2015, there was over 200 countries that signed up for a treaty that really suggested that every country was going to make their best commitment to lower emissions in their economy. We've now backed away from that international treaty, and that's an important issue. We're the largest economy in the world. A lot of countries look to us for leadership, and on this issue, we're just not leading as valiantly as we could. And so stepping up and making an international commitment and inspiring others to do the same would be one of those things. Another idea would be, there's so much entrepreneurial innovation energy in the United States. We could set tax policies that would really stimulate entrepreneurs and innovators to create solutions that don't require us to make hard lifestyle decisions on the future of this issue. And I think that's how a lot of people think about this, is if I'm going to be active on climate change and I'm foregoing a lifestyle that I really want right now. We really have a great history in this country of being tremendously innovative. And so by setting policies that would really reward innovation in this area and really sponsor what I'd call another man on the moon project, we could both grow our economy and solve this issue.
Excellent. We talked about drawdown a little bit on the phone. So are there any of the other things that are in drawdown that are like big ideas? You started to mention soil before we sat down, but I know we've already covered that a bit. But you might anything else those kind of big ideas that have that feel like this could really move the needle?
The one solution that I think has real potential is just to think about agriculture differently. Agriculture, and I've mentioned this because we sit in one of the real bread baskets of the whole world. Just right here where we're located in Kansas City, you go 100 miles around this area and it's where the world comes to get food. And the way that we do agriculture could regenerate ecosystems, could change the function of these ecosystems so it would be better for our local environment, but it would actually draw a meaningful amount of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it safely in the soil. Over the last 100 years, the farming methods that have been popularized in this country and all around the world have slowly but surely emitted carbon into the atmosphere. Now, nobody tried to do that. We didn't know that that was happening. I come from a farm, and I've done a lot of those things by accident, just because I didn't know. But now we know. Now we have the knowledge to farm differently, to graze our animals differently, to capture a lot of the waste streams in agriculture and redeploy them back into the soil so that our soils get built back up for future generations. I think that's a big idea, and it's one of the most exciting things I think is going on in the conservation movement right now, is the idea that agriculture doesn't have to be extractive. It can actually be very restorative in the way it's practiced.
Great. Can you say just a little bit more about what that looks like practically speaking? This is, like what are those things that farmers can do that so far the idea of extracting carbon and making sure you're storing it back in the earth sounds sci-fi, but tell me what it actually looks like.
One of the great ways to think about this is God gave us a solution already. And that is that every green living plant carries out photosynthesis. So whether it's a tree or a blade of grass or a prairie, plants recruit carbon dioxide into its green leafy tissue. It separates the carbon and runs that down through the plant to create energy for the plant, and eventually stores the excess carbon through the roots in the soil while emitting the oxygen to the atmosphere through respiration. What a wonderful technology. I wish we could invent it, but we didn't have to. God did that. And so the way we manage these plants can increase that photosynthetic activity. How long we graze cattle, the timing of when we put them on and we take them off. When we till the soil, or when we conduct agriculture, not tilling the soil makes a big difference. Any time that we want a green living plant in the soil. We want roots that are active, we want plants that are growing. And even when it's a hard winter here, plants will actually slow down and stop growing, but their roots are active. So just keeping the landscape covered with green living plants is a huge solution. And that may sound like a small thing, but the math works. The math adds up to be a very material solution to climate change. So if we could start that movement here and get that to go around the world, that would make a big difference on this issue.
And is it primarily farmers and the farming techniques, or is it all of us in some way?
Another great solution here is that we all have backyards. We all have the ability to go out and raise some of our own food. And so these techniques can be brought right into your family. The one thing I would suggest here is planting a yard that looks very different than your neighbor's. So not just a single blade of grass or a single type of grass, but a polyculture. One that's got several different green living plants growing there together actually it's actually going to bring more carbon into the soil and store it, and your soil's going to get better. So little things like that, the way we interact with our own footprint could make a difference.
Excellent. Okay, what else do you want to say to 12,000 people this weekend?
I think people of faith have a special opportunity to lead on this issue. I think that we as an organization, as an institution, as a church in this community, but also a church that others are watching, we could make a change. I'd love to see us make some movement on this issue. The next decade will make a difference. We need to make some big changes in the way that we address this issue over the next decade. And I know as a church, we have a commitment to provide leadership in this community. And I'd love to see this be one of those commitments. I think we could make a huge difference on this issue.
Excellent. So this may not be for the video, but what would you say to our church council, our leadership, as to the best way for Resurrection to use its influence and to affect the greatest possible good on this?
I think the church does have an opportunity to lead on this issue. This issue does get a little bit polarized as you go from the coast to the Midwest, and certainly in the Midwest there's a difference in attitudes around that issue. I think there'd be a lot of interest in how the church, is having a special place in rural communities and in the Midwest, could introduce this topic in a way that comes from a perspective of personal values and identity. And I think there's an opportunity here too, economically and for rural communities and for institutions to really think about this as more of an opportunity rather than a divisive issue. So I think there's a lot of organizations interested to partner with the church right now, interested to know how the church could do more on this topic.
Good, excellent. My last question for you is, looking at the Pew Research information, you've got X amount of the older generations don't believe that humans are affecting climate change, not really sure what to think about climate change. The younger you get, the more people are convinced that there are anthropogenic causes to this. Democrats see this much more likely, human-related, Republicans less likely. You get to younger Republicans, they're more likely to see it than older Republicans, that this is anthropogenic causes. What would you say to people who are sitting in church Sunday and not really sure they buy all this?
I think this is a complex issue, and I think it's very reasonable for people who haven't looked at this issue carefully to have doubts. I was in that category 15 years ago. I honestly hadn't studied the issue, and I was predisposed to think it was maybe a conspiracy. And so I found a scientist that I really trusted, and I spent a long time with him. And I challenged him to prove it to me that this was more real than not. And I wouldn't say at that moment I was just 100% convinced, but it set me on a journey to be really curious. And I'm a Christian. And the more that I started to think about what I'd learned about the science, think about my values, I became convinced that it's going to be important for us to be on the front side of acting here. I think we as Christians have a greater moral responsibility. It's part of our faith walk. Not everything in our faith can be proved scientifically.
Yeah.
I would just urge people to consider that. And so I think it's also very reasonable for people to have doubts. And I wouldn't want anybody to feel less than, or feel like, if you do have questions, that there's not a role for you in this discussion. In fact, I would just encourage people that have questions just to say, honestly, I haven't looked at this issue enough, and I'd like to find people that I could talk to about it and learn more. That's what started me on my journey.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, that's cool.